mathematical scientist at the Statistics Service Center at the University of Reading, UK. But I have learned that his speciality is that he has one, say, big footprint in African statistics. So he is very engaged in different forms in helping African statistics to be improved. David.
Okay, my main role here is to try and stimulate discussion. But before I do that, I'm going to present very briefly Peter's talk. Now, I hope I'll do him justice. It's sort of condensed. So I've taken, he gave me his presentation, and I've tried to condense it into a rather shorter talk, but with, I hope, the key points. His talk was titled Statistics and Lampposts, for support or for illumination. I hope by the time we get to discussion, this will actually be a very meaningful point. And his talk will bring out some of it, and then I hope it will then feed into our discussion. The administrative use of national accounts data. This is really the angle he was coming from. He was saying he was looking at indicators and how they're used, and the fact that they're being used more and more for monitoring, for benchmarking, so there's actual, the amount you contribute in the EU is determined by an indicator. They're used for thresholds. If you meet this threshold, you meet this criteria, you're eligible for certain reliefs and these sorts of things. And because these statistical indicators have such power, he was then wanting to look at the advantages and the disadvantages that using them as benchmarks and as thresholds brings to society. So the advantages, I think, are things which we all think of, and they're considerable. The fact that they're used as thresholds, as benchmarks, helps us to sort of make sure the quality is really there, that they're really consistent, that we are saying the same things across different societies. It normally leads to better metadata, because we need to show that it's come from the right places. And he talks about the sort of instruments for checking the appropriateness of the estimates. And his final point relates back to something which I think we've heard more and more, that it's about the awareness of statistics, the fact that we need our policymakers to know about these statistical indicators, to understand them, to understand what they actually mean, if they're going to be using them to know whether we qualify for this criteria or not. The disadvantages he brings out were sort of really quite striking. Some of these I wasn't aware of. So the idea of them being sort of prioritising certain aspects over others is something which I think is again clear. And the fact that it brings artificial importance to the data behind those indicators is also. One of the aspects which I wasn't aware of, which he brings out, is this idea that it leads to a skewing of the data, the way we use some of the data. An example he uses is that of the pensions and the way the pension funds are used sometimes. That if you have a public pension fund, then it's a way of changing or if you go from public to private pension funds, it's a way of, in some sense, changing your bank balance for the government in terms of these indicators. And so there are explicit ways where you can manipulate the indicators without actually changing fundamentally the effect on society, and maybe sort of just by understanding what they are and using the way they calculate. And this is, his expression, you can be exactly wrong about the state of something rather than approximately right, because according to that indicator, you've calculated very exactly, you've got it very precisely, but it's maybe not telling you the right information. And this is also this issue about you only getting part of the story. If everything is tied into certain indicators, you're not getting the whole picture. You're only looking at a certain part of the story. And he really brings this out, I think, quite nicely by looking at what some possible alternative indicators could be for things like deficit and debt. For the deficits, he brings out a couple of sort of alternatives which could be used instead of the current deficit, which is net lending against borrowing. One of his alternatives is about net savings, so it's the current incomes minus the expenditures. A second alternative would be a change in net worth due to savings and capital transfers. And I think if we look at sort of the graph he brings out when comparing the net savings to the actual indicator of deficit which is used, you see that actually this does represent different societies very differently. Ireland is particularly visible at one end, where you've got a real substantial change in how the country would be viewed. And there's a few other examples where, again, having this sort of different indicator would really change your perception of the society in terms of its deficit. This is brought out again in debt, where he gives a couple of other indicators, and I want to particularly focus in this case on the fact here of, so here he's got net debt against gross debt. And Finland, which is so present here, is one of the wonderful examples where this would totally change the way the debt is perceived for the country. So where he leads to with all this is, what should we do as statisticians? And I think, I'm just going to leave this up for a little bit of time and go through it briefly, so we can think about these ideas, safeguarding the independence, thinking and acting in the broader context, stop focusing too much on single indicators, provide additional data, providing more metadata and information on possible caveats, and adding more storytelling by putting the data into context. I see this last issue of putting the data into context as being one which particularly resonates with the idea of statistical literacy. This idea that we need people to be able to understand the data in context rather than simply using the data to say what they want it to say. And this brings us to his quote. An unsophisticated forecaster or economist or policymaker uses statistics as a drunken man uses lampposts, for support rather than illumination. I hope I've managed to get across the main idea. I'm going to move on to my main role, which is that of discussant, and to try and get you to think and to ask questions about the topic, which is statistical literacy, particularly for decision makers. As you've heard, my interest, I really came into statistics through Africa. I worked for 6 years as a local lecturer in Kenya, and I went in as a pure mathematician doing algebraic geometry related to string theory, and I came out as a statistics educator. Africa is very, very good for actually bringing you down to ground and maybe making you a more useful individual. And so I'm going to go through 5 questions, which I hope will then help us to stimulate discussion and to really think about some of the issues which I think have been brought up by different speakers already. My first question is, what do we believe improved statistics literacy will lead to? And this is I think really at the heart of what I think we should be asking ourselves. We've already said statistics are not an end in themselves. why are we wanting improved statistical literacy? And I think we all have good answers to this. But we need to think about those answers very carefully, and we need to say, are we just doing this for our own ends? Or do we have these good answers as to why we're doing it? This relates also to the statement, statistics are for everybody, but they're only useful when used, which again we heard from Statistics Finland earlier, and from Mario. I want to focus in on something where one of the reasons I believe statistics literacy is so important, but is maybe not obvious. Can we use statistics literacy to fight against extremism? One of the growing security threats of our time is possibly the problems which are coming out of extremism. What's the relationship with statistics literacy? Well, I think that comes back to these ideas about rational against statistical decision making. Extremists are, by and large, making rational decisions according to their knowledge, according to their beliefs. Maybe if we were able to have more statistical understanding where it's not just about making what seem to be rational decisions from our perspectives, but seem to be decisions which are more objective, which are looking at a bigger picture, maybe that is the difference between statistical decision making and rational decision making. And so maybe this is important, really it's a societal level, to help combat some of the big problems of our time. There's also the question of whose responsibility is it to promote statistical literacy and to help train people. Is it the responsibility of the statistical agencies? Is it educators? I'm going to take a little aside here because one of the things I've learnt from my time in Africa is to be broad, to think more generally, to be a bit more ambitious. When you think about how our training works as academics, a lot of us are academics, we eventually go through an education system and get to a PhD, which makes us inherently narrow. That's sort of the culmination of our education system is to be narrow, focused on something very small. But the problems we're facing are interlinked, they're interconnected. We need to take interdisciplinary approaches. Current education systems aren't really built to encourage that. They're built to get people to the pinnacle of current knowledge. So, one of the things I've learned is that you need to be able to think, if you're going to actually try and really affect systems, you need to be able to try and think across different academic levels. Most of my successes in Kenya came from the fact that I was doing things at master's level and my students were taking it down to schools, to diploma programs. And the same basic ideas held across. And actually, there's a very good synergies that come because, surprisingly enough, people move up education levels. And if you've got a coherent system, then they move very naturally. And they're building on what they did before. If you only have people making decisions about school education who don't make decisions about undergraduate education, there's a disconnect. That disconnect is one which I think many countries can relate to. I think the reason I took that aside relates to this idea of promoting statistical literacy. I'm not sure I agree with that it's the responsibility of the statistics agencies. I think it needs a broader responsibility. Yes, they should be involved, but it needs to have educators at all levels as well. It needs to be something which is a collaborative effort. And so one of the things I would like people to think about when we're having this discussion is, what range of actors do we need and how are they going to work together? How do we work across agencies? And that's something which I would like people to bring into the discussion. We've heard about the Eurostats tool, the website. And so what are the different tools that we need to promote statistic literacy? And what works in different environments? Where should we build the tools for? If we build tools that work where you have good internet, where everything always works, will those tools still be applicable elsewhere? If we build tools which work as somewhere where your internet doesn't work very well, and you don't have great access to technology, you have something, will those tools still be useful elsewhere? I do a lot of work now in education, and over 90% of educational research is done in high-resource environments, where what you learn does not apply elsewhere. Very little educational research happens in low-resource environments, where the results you find may be very scalable. I believe the same may be true for statistical literacy. If we find solutions for statistical literacy that work in Southern Sudan, the youngest country, those tools may apply elsewhere. They may be useful in parts of America where you actually are finding it difficult to reach schools because at the moment the educational system is not supported. You may find that there's more applicability from what you learn in low resource environments than high resource environments, and the tools you need. And I'm going to finish really in terms of the questions with this interesting question brought up by Peter. This question of statistics for support or illumination. And I love Peter's quote. I thought it was excellent, but I'm not sure I agree totally with the sentiment. I agree that as statisticians, we should and we need to be using statistics for illumination. We need to be exploring, we need to be seeing what's there, we need to be finding what's underlying. But the whole idea of evidence-based decision making is to make decisions based on, supported by evidence. Now the key is to avoid pseudoscience. Pseudoscience, you know the answer and you try to look for the evidence that you are right. But this, to me, this is not such an easy question. Are we looking for statistics to support evidence-based decision making? Or are we simply using statistics to try and explore and identify and illuminate ourselves about what's happening in the world? I think there's need for both. Thank you.
Let me logistically lead the discussion. So, no, please, let's do it in a tandem way. Let's stand here. So my role is to give the floor to questions and people in the room, and your role is to give the answers. Okay, so let's raise the questions. The floor is open. So we have a microphone. I think Ian was first. The gentleman in the middle. No, please.
First, I'd like to congratulate all the speakers on the excellent papers. Obvious, we need to expand this session into a full-day seminar. By the way, my name is Ian McLean, United Kingdom. So I'll restrict myself to one simple question, comment on classifications. I've heard it was discussed for over 40 years without ever anyone reached a conclusion. Is it now perhaps time for us to try to set up a universally accepted version of classification that we can all use? Thank you.
Which classification do you have in mind?
We're talking about marketing really behind all this discussion. Marketing means segmentation because each part of the market responds differently.
Okay.
So when we look at classifications, we are identifying all the different market segments that we're facing. In the United Kingdom, our approach has been to look at sector groups. So we have sector groups for education, crime, business and so on. But it's much more than that. As I said, it would be helpful if we could have perhaps an agreed system where we classified users into all these different segments. Thank you.
Okay, let's take 2 more questions on board, and then we will have a round of answers. I think the gentleman over there. Yes. Eduardo. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Eduardo Rojon. I work at the EGI in Mexico, National Institute for Statistics and Geography. I don't know if this is for you, the question I mean. Mario said something that they have a micro simulation model. In the statistics, especially official statistics, we always try to not to get into models. But once we hear some presentations like Mario, Noriega, I think is also doing some modeling. I don't know if this is kind of a new, as Mariana said in the seminar yesterday, a business of official statistics. We need some kind of modeling to provide simulation, and what is the opinion of the panel. And thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you, Eduardo. Then third question, the gentleman here, and then we will have
thank you. I'm Arun Sivananda Naidu from Statistics South Africa. I like the question that you raised, who is responsible for literacy? I was fortunate in that in the first half of my career I was an academic teaching at university, and now I work for an NSO. And neither the university nor the NSO is doing anything towards literacy. As a lecturer at the university, we tend to teach what my professor learned at his first year statistics. He was providing a support service to the majority of students. And at the NSO, we have people who've been working for 20 years or so collecting surveys and data, but they think that's the end of the job. They don't want to take it further to disseminate. I think somewhere we need to have some kind of, or use the word whip, to get somebody in line to say, it's your job, you need to do it, or it's a combination of people's jobs to effort, because there's a really big need for it out from the user point of view.
Okay, so I think we have had 3 questions. The speakers are invited to give an answer. I think one was particular for Mario, one more for Maurizio. And yeah, okay. It's a bit difficult to organize because we are.
Thanks for the question regarding the microsimulation model. The richness of the model is within the rich statistical or rich amount of data behind it. So maybe it is, I think it is a new kind of service that you can develop when you have enough data. So in the micro level, and you combine it in a system, and then you build the micro simulation on top, and that's based on, that's the idea behind it. And don't ask me how it is built, of course. I have been shown how it is used, but it is even too complicated for me to use, so you have to have some skills, definitely skills. And it is not something that everybody can use. It is for certain research people who are skilled and who have the sort of license to use it.
As regards the classification, The classification is, my proposal is to use clustering methods to classify, not to classify according to a single feature, but considering several features, because otherwise the classical type of classification that we have frequently also in official statistics are more based on non-statistical methods, no? On classification based on reasonings inside the experts. So I would use for users a classification that is based on a technical statistical method to obtain classification on homogeneous users according to their interest and their characteristics. As regards the simulation as a new way to use data, I think for artificial statistics, I think it's very useful to use these new techniques of bootstrapping that use actually real data. You do not simulate from distributions, but you take subsamples of data with some specific characteristics, maybe better people who have better well-being, for example, and then you see, from this subsample you can see how one scenario, you can define one scenario, and so you can compare different scenarios just by resampling with different features, taking into consideration these features fixed according to some fixed set of variables. You have some set of variables such as GDP that you fixed, you want to have high GDP, so you subsample just people who have high GDP, and you compare with other, for example, people who have low GDP, and you can make different scenarios coming from different subset of observation that you have observed. So they are not really simulated, but just real data.
Okay.
Very quickly relating to this sort of syphilipsy falling through the gap. But I think part of the problem is, in some sense, this desire to have concrete classifications. That creates these gaps. That, sometimes we need to actually work, and accept that the classification isn't quite perfect, that there isn't a good distinction between roles, and that might help us to sort of find different solutions in different countries.
Okay, more questions? We start then now on that side, the gentleman on the left, then we go.
Hello, my name is Pedro Campos from the University of Porto and Statistics Portugal. I'm also in the ISLP, so I'd like to start only by giving an answer for that first question about the ISLP resources by our colleague of the University of Minnesota. So she asked about the resources. Maybe it's important to clarify that the ISLP is not a resource creator, so we don't create resources.